The other pilots burst into laughter when Sarah powered down the A-10 simulator after what they called her reckless canyon run. Captain Mike Henderson wiped tears from his eyes as he replayed her flight footage on the main screen, shaking his head at the impossibly low-altitude maneuvers she had just executed through the virtual canyon system. "You flew that thing like a crop duster gone insane, Sarah," he said between chuckles. The flight computer was screaming terrain warnings the entire time. Lieutenant Jake Morrison joined in from across the simulator room, pointing at her scarred hands as she removed her flight gloves. "Look at those burn marks on her hands, probably from all the crashes in training." Sarah Collins remained silent as she gathered her flight gear, her jaw set but her expression calm. The transport squadron had assigned her to simulator duty for the past 18 months, and these sessions always ended the same way. Her unconventional flying techniques drew mockery from the other pilots who flew by the book, maintaining safe altitudes and standard approach patterns. Henderson continued his commentary as other pilots gathered around the replay screen. "She thinks she is still flying combat missions instead of running supply drops to forward bases. Those canyon flying fantasies will get someone killed in real aircraft, Sarah." The room filled with more laughter as her flight path showed impossibly tight turns between canyon walls, maintaining barely 12 feet of clearance while targeting ground positions with precision strikes. Wing Commander Patricia Walsh entered the simulator room just as Henderson was describing Sarah's flight path as suicidal showboating. The laughter died immediately as the pilots snapped to attention, but Walsh's eyes were fixed on the replay screen where Sarah's A-10 maneuvered through the canyon with impossible precision. The commanders studied the flight data for several long seconds while the room remained silent. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as Walsh rewound the footage, watching the low-altitude sequence again. The burn scars on Sarah's hands seemed to throb as she waited for another reprimand about reckless flying. "Collins," Walsh said quietly, still staring at the screen. "That canyon approach pattern, those strike coordinates." She turned slowly to face Sarah directly. "What was your call sign in combat operations?" Sarah hesitated, knowing this moment would change everything. The other pilots exchanged confused glances, not understanding why the wing commander's tone had shifted from disciplinary to something approaching reverence. "Thunderbolt, ma'am," Sarah replied in a voice barely above a whisper. Wing Commander Walsh's expression transformed completely. She straightened and rendered a crisp salute that left every pilot in the room frozen in shock. "Captain Collins," she said with unmistakable respect, "you are the Thunderbolt who saved the 3rd Battalion in Kandahar Canyon." Henderson's jaw dropped as he finally understood who had been sitting in their simulator room for 18 months. The emergency klaxon pierced through the base 3 days after Sarah's identity revelation, sending pilots scrambling toward the operations center. Sarah found herself swept along with Henderson and Morrison, who had been awkwardly attempting to make amends since learning about her legendary status in canyon warfare. Major Reynolds stood before the tactical display, showing satellite imagery of the Tangi Valley, his face grim as he briefed the assembled pilots. "Alpha Company, 2nd Marines are pinned down in Sector 7 after their convoy was ambushed," he announced. 23 Marines trapped in a canyon system with enemy forces advancing from both flanks. Sarah studied the terrain data, recognizing the narrow gorge walls and steep approach angles that would challenge any conventional aircraft. The valley measured barely 50 feet wide at its narrowest point, with rock formations that would tear apart any pilot attempting standard rescue procedures at regulation altitudes. 2 F-16s have already aborted their approach due to terrain constraints, Reynolds continued. The canyon walls are too steep for normal close air support, and the enemy has anti-aircraft positions covering all standard flight paths. Henderson glanced nervously at Sarah, finally understanding why her simulator maneuvers had seemed so unusual. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the tactical situation developing. The Marines needed extraction from terrain that would require exactly the kind of low-altitude precision flying that had earned her the nickname Thunderbolt years ago in similar canyons halfway around the world. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly over the next hour as enemy forces tightened their grip around the trapped Marines. Major Reynolds received updates every few minutes, each report more dire than the last. Sarah watched the digital countdown clock showing 18 minutes until enemy forces would be within grenade range of the Marines' defensive position. A Navy helicopter pilot had attempted a rescue approach but was forced to abort when rocket-propelled grenades bracketed his aircraft near the canyon entrance. The terrain simply wouldn't allow conventional rotary wing operations, and the narrow gorge walls created deadly wind shears that made hovering impossible. Staff Sergeant Williams from Alpha Company transmitted another urgent situation report over the tactical radio. Enemy squad moving through the north approach, estimated 12 hostiles with heavy weapons. We need immediate close air support or extraction within the next 15 minutes. Sarah felt her hands clench involuntarily as she studied the canyon's three-dimensional map projection. The Marines were positioned at the deepest point of the gorge, surrounded by rock walls that rose nearly vertical for 300 feet. Any aircraft attempting to engage the enemy positions would need to fly below the canyon rim, maintaining precise altitude control while delivering accurate weapons fire. Wing Commander Walsh entered the operations center and immediately sought out Sarah's position among the gathered personnel. The expression on Walsh's face made it clear that conventional rescue options had been exhausted and desperate measures were now being considered for the impossible mission. Wing Commander Walsh approached Sarah with deliberate steps, her expression carrying the weight of command decisions that could mean life or death for 23 Marines. "Captain Collins, I need to speak with you privately about the Tangi Valley situation." They moved to a quiet corner of the operations center while the countdown clock displayed 11 minutes until the enemy reached effective range of the Marine position. Sarah's throat tightened as she anticipated what Walsh was about to request, knowing it would mean returning to the kind of flying that had haunted her dreams for 18 months. "Collins," Walsh said quietly, "you are the only pilot on this base with canyon warfare experience at the altitudes required for this mission. The A-10 can deliver the firepower those Marines need, but only if someone can fly it through terrain that has defeated every other aircraft today." Sarah stared at the tactical display, showing the narrow gorge where her fellow service members were fighting for their lives. Her scarred hands trembled slightly as she remembered the last time she had flown combat missions in similar terrain, the day her wingman died in a canyon just like this one. "I haven't flown combat operations since the incident in Afghanistan," Sarah replied, her voice barely audible above the radio chatter filling the operations center. "Those Marines need someone who won't freeze up when the walls close in." Walsh placed a firm hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Those Marines need Thunderbolt," she said with conviction. "You're the only person who can bring them home alive." Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision as she conducted the pre-flight inspection of the A-10 Thunderbolt, her fingers tracing control surfaces and weapon systems she hadn't operated in combat for 18 months. The aircraft sat ready on the tarmac, while maintenance crews made final adjustments to the 30mm cannon and external fuel tanks. Henderson and Morrison stood nearby, no longer the mocking pilots from the simulator room, but fellow aviators watching one of their own prepare for an impossible mission. The same hands they had ridiculed for their burn scars now worked with surgical precision, checking every system that would keep her alive in the narrow canyon. Weather conditions were deteriorating as afternoon winds began channeling through the mountain passes, creating the kind of turbulence that could slam an aircraft into canyon walls without warning. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she reviewed the mission parameters one final time, knowing that any mistake would mean death for both herself and the trapped Marines. The radio crackled with another urgent transmission from Staff Sergeant Williams. "Enemy forces now within 50 meters of our position. We need immediate air support or we will be overrun in the next few minutes." Sarah climbed into the cockpit and began the engine startup sequence, her muscle memory taking over as the twin turbofan engines spooled up to operational power. Wing Commander Walsh's voice came through her headset with final mission authorization as Sarah prepared to prove that her current flying skills matched the legendary reputation of Thunderbolt. Sarah's A-10 screamed through the canyon entrance at an altitude that would have terrified any conventional pilot, her wingtips clearing the rock walls by mere feet as she descended into the narrow gorge. The terrain avoidance system shrieked continuous warnings while she maintained precise control through violent wind shears that threatened to slam her aircraft into the canyon walls. Enemy muzzle flashes erupted from concealed positions along the ridge lines as hostile forces opened fire on her aircraft. Sarah rolled inverted and pulled through an impossible turn that brought her below the canyon rim, using the rock formations as cover while she acquired targets through her heads-up display. The 30mm cannon roared to life as Sarah engaged the enemy squad advancing on a marine position, her rounds impacting with devastating accuracy despite the challenging flight conditions. She pulled up sharply to avoid a rocket-propelled grenade that detonated against the canyon wall behind her, debris peppering her aircraft without penetrating the armored cockpit. Staff Sergeant Williams transmitted his amazement over the tactical frequency as Sarah's gun runs eliminated the immediate threat to his defensive position. Thunderbolt, that was the most incredible flying I have ever witnessed, rounds on target at 12 feet altitude through a 50-foot canyon. Sarah executed another impossibly tight turn between the canyon walls, demonstrating the same precision flying techniques that had earned mockery in the simulator room, but now proved essential for mission success in the deadly confines of Tangi Valley. Sarah's final gun run cleared the remaining enemy positions from the northern approach, allowing the rescue helicopters to finally enter the canyon safely. She maintained overwatch at impossibly low altitude, her aircraft weaving between rock formations while coordinating the extraction of all 23 Marines from their defensive position. The lead helicopter pilot transmitted his gratitude over the emergency frequency as his aircraft touched down in the narrow landing zone that Sarah had secured through precise fire support. Thunderbolt, you just accomplished what 3 different aircraft types declared impossible today. Staff Sergeant Williams and his Marines moved quickly toward the extraction birds while Sarah continued her protective circles overhead, her fuel gauges showing critically low levels after the extended combat operations. She had pushed both herself and her aircraft beyond normal operational limits to complete this mission. Radio chatter filled with amazed commentary from pilots back at base who were monitoring her tactical frequency, listening to real-time accounts of flying maneuvers that defied conventional wisdom about A-10 operations in restrictive terrain. The same techniques that had drawn simulator room mockery were now being described as legendary airmanship. As the final helicopter cleared the canyon with its rescued Marines aboard, Sarah executed one last impossible climb between the canyon walls, pulling her A-10 up through the narrow gap with fuel vapors trailing from her nearly empty tanks. She had successfully confronted both her personal trauma and the tactical challenge, proving that Thunderbolt remained fully operational despite 18 months away from combat flying. Sarah's A-10 touched down on the base runway to a scene she had never experienced in her military career. Ground crews, maintenance personnel, and dozens of pilots lined the taxiway, applauding as her aircraft rolled toward the parking area with fuel gauges reading empty and battle damage visible along the wing surfaces. Henderson and Morrison were among the first to reach her aircraft as she shut down the engines, their faces showing genuine admiration rather than the mockery that had defined their previous interactions. Captain Collins, Henderson said as Sarah climbed down from the cockpit, "What you accomplished today will be taught in flight schools for the next 50 years. Wing Commander Walsh approached with several senior officers who had monitored the entire mission from the operations center. The radio recordings of her tactical flying are already being reviewed by Air Force Weapons School instructors," she announced to the gathered crowd. That canyon rescue will become the textbook example of precision, close air support. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the transformation in how her fellow pilots viewed her capabilities. The same burn-scarred hands that had been ridiculed 3 days earlier were now being praised as the steady hands that saved 23 Marines through impossible flying conditions. Morrison stepped forward with uncharacteristic humility. "Sarah, I owe you an apology for everything I said about your simulator flying. You were practicing techniques that none of us understood, preparing for missions that we never imagined possible. The entire squadron now recognized that her unconventional methods represented tactical genius rather than reckless showboating. Word of Sarah's impossible canyon rescue spread throughout Air Force installations within hours of the mission completion. Flight instructors at Nellis Air Force Base requested copies of her gun camera footage to study the precision flying techniques that had saved 23 Marines in terrain deemed impossible for fixed-wing aircraft operations. Staff Sergeant Williams called Sarah directly from the medical facility where his Marines were being treated for minor injuries sustained during their firefight. Captain Collins, he said over the secure phone line, "My Marines want you to know that you are already a legend among the ground troops who heard about today's mission." The Air Force Weapons School officially requested Sarah's transfer to become a specialized instructor in canyon warfare tactics, recognizing that her unconventional simulator training had actually been development of revolutionary close air support techniques. Her methods would now be taught to the next generation of A-10 pilots facing similar terrain challenges. Henderson approached Sarah in the squadron-ready room with a flight manual he had been studying. "These maneuvers you demonstrated today," he said respectfully, "they require spatial awareness and aircraft control that most pilots never develop. I would consider it an honor if you would teach me some of those techniques." The same pilots who had mocked her flying just days earlier now sought her mentorship, understanding that Sarah's expertise represented the evolution of tactical aviation rather than dangerous recklessness. Her transformation from ridiculed transport pilot to legendary combat instructor was complete. 6 months later, Sarah stood before a classroom of advanced A-10 pilots at the Air Force Weapons School, teaching the canyon warfare techniques that had once earned mockery in a simulator room. Her scarred hands moved confidently across the tactical display as she explained the precision required for low-altitude operations in restrictive terrain. The 23 Marines from Alpha Company attended her change of command ceremony when she officially became the lead instructor for specialized close air support tactics. Staff Sergeant Williams presented her with a unit patch signed by every Marine she had rescued, thanking Thunderbolt for bringing them home alive. Henderson and Morrison had both volunteered for her advanced training program, eager to learn from the pilot they had once ridiculed. The simulator room, where Sarah's flying had been mocked now, bore a plaque commemorating the Tangi Valley rescue mission and honoring her innovative tactical development. Wing Commander Walsh delivered the keynote address at Sarah's promotion ceremony, describing how one pilot's determination to maintain unconventional skills had revolutionized close air support doctrine for canyon operations. Sarah's techniques were now standard curriculum at every A-10 training squadron. As Sarah looked out at the assembled crowd of fellow pilots, Marines, and Air Force leadership, she reflected on the journey from mockery to legendary status. Her story had become base folklore, inspiring other pilots to pursue excellence despite criticism from those who failed to understand innovation. Have you ever had to prove yourself when everyone doubted your abilities? Share your moment when you had to show what you were really made of in the comments below. The simulator room emptied quickly after Wing Commander Walsh's salute, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of her revealed identity. Henderson and Morrison exchanged uncertain glances before offering awkward apologies that felt hollow after months of ridicule about her unconventional flying techniques and burn-scarred hands. Sarah gathered her flight gear in silence, remembering the day those scars were earned in another canyon halfway around the world. Her wingman, Lieutenant David Chun, had been flying beside her when the enemy surface-to-air missile detonated near his aircraft, sending flaming debris that scarred her hands as she fought to control her damaged A-10. The nightmares had started immediately after that mission, forcing the Air Force to reassign her to transport duties while she underwent psychological evaluation. 18 months of flying supply runs and simulator training had been her attempt to prove she could still fly, even if not in combat situations that reminded her of David's death. Henderson approached her cautiously near the equipment lockers. "Captain Collins, I had no idea about your service record in Afghanistan. We never meant to dishonor what you accomplished over there." Sarah looked up at him with tired eyes that had seen too much combat for someone her age. "Those canyon runs you mocked in the simulator were my way of staying sharp," she replied quietly. "David died because I hesitated for 2 seconds in terrain just like this. I practiced those maneuvers because 23 Marines somewhere might depend on me not hesitating again.